Hey, it's Kay. And this is Skittles, master of all four elements. And these boys right here, well, this is Brian Big Boy Konietzko and Michael Tortellini DiMartino, the creators of Avatar. Following the success of The Last Airbender, Brian and Michael set out to create a more mature follow-up series that would introduce nuanced political themes. The only problem is, Mike and Brian don't understand political ideologies. Set 70 years after the events of The Last Airbender, The Legend of Korra takes place in Republic City, capital of the United Republic, a parallel of the industrial capitalism and cultural melting pot of the United States in the early 20th century. While Aang and the crew spent the entirety of The Last Airbender working toward defeating the genocidal expansionist Fire Nation to restore balance to the world, and in that case balance is specifically understood to mean national liberation and peace, Korra lives in a world without a clear, singular enemy. The Avatar is a being dedicated to preserving balance, but when problems are more complicated than simply defeat the big bad, what is balance? Throughout the 4 seasons of the show, Korra faces off against antagonists who represent their own distinct political ideologies, who've risen up as a response to the problems caused by the rapid onset of this industrial capitalist society. The boys basically use this series to play out the ideological conflicts of the 20th century, but you won't be surprised to hear that the deck is rigged. So let's discuss our antagonists. Enter the Equalists. Led by Amon, a mysterious masked figure who we'll get to in a moment, the Equalists are a group of non-benders who are organizing against what they say is a ruling class of benders who have been exploiting and oppressing them. Their goal is to take this power from them and build a world where all are equal. Have you figured out which political ideology these guys represent yet? Bending in this case serves as an allegory for wealth and the power that comes along with it. In our real world, most of the wealth and land is held by a small number of people who are able to exercise incredible amounts of influence over the populace. And who is our protagonist? Our foil to this revolutionary movement? The Avatar, the ultimate bender. If bending is wealth and power, then she is Jeff fucking Bezos. She frequently expects special treatment and assumes she's entitled to a certain status as the Avatar. And even though the conceit of the political ideologies explored in this show is that our heroes must confront these ideas and determine where they're right and where they go too far, Korra doesn't really do the former with the Equalists. She's dismissive of them from start to finish.
You're oppressing yourself!
That didn't even make sense!
In Amon's scenes, he's often portrayed like a monster in a horror movie, even down to the music.
The time has come for benders to experience fear.
He's less of a person than a nebulously bad thing. He causes only fear in our hero. Honestly, Amon is made out to be more horrifying to Korra than the Fire Lord ever was to Aang, who was like 10 years old at the time. Korra has nightmares about him taking her bending away. She feels a genuine existential terror because bending in this universe isn't just power. It's also a fundamental part of who someone is. See, the boys have crafted an allegory in which socialism doesn't just take your wealth, it takes your individuality. It takes your very sense of self. Here's where the shortcomings and indeed the hidden intent behind this allegory begin to unravel. See, bending cannot be redistributed. You either have bending or you don't. In reality, wealth is an accumulation of resources that can be redistributed. However, if the redistribution of wealth and indeed of power is something you don't really consider realistic, then this allegory makes a lot more sense. Writing things this way might give us some clues as to how the boys view wealth and power, which are treated as just part of who someone is. and it would be like killing a part of them to take it away. Amon's goal is to make people equal by taking the power from the upper class of society who have undue advantages over everyone else that they're using for personal profit and to solidify a caste of people who are a higher level of citizen. Now, Amon does this by taking away their bending, and then it's gone. Of course, in the real-world parallel, a working-class revolution taking the property, land, and wealth from an upper class of society, it has a key difference. That property, land, and wealth, it doesn't disappear, it is collectivized and redistributed. The picture that the boys paint of redistributing resources is one of destruction. Much like the Cuban exile who complains that Castro took all their family's mansions, they only view the taking. The part where these resources continue to be used, possibly in more useful ways than they were before, it's invisible to them. From their perspective, they were robbed, and that's the end of the story. When thinking about that perspective, we start to put together a clearer image of the understanding the boys have of socialism, of resource redistribution. There is no collectivization. There is no putting land to use for the good of the people, or even just for the good of somebody else. It's just gone. There is only a theft. The thing ceases to exist after that point, and if that's how you perceive wealth redistribution, then of course you'd oppose socialism. By this understanding, its only goal is to unfairly take things from people for no reason and to no advantage of anyone else. And indeed, our protagonist is the person who would have the most to lose from this. You'll find people who have this perspective on socialism don't seem to be as critical of the relationship between, say, the employer and the employee, in which much of the value produced by the actual labor of a worker is stolen for the enrichment of a small number of people. Although even in that case, that value, it doesn't vanish into thin air. The form that Amon's allegorical wealth redistribution takes is one of wealth destruction. One of making everyone poorer out of a dogmatic pursuit of being equal. And if you've ever heard an opponent of socialism try to explain why socialism is bad and evil, you'll notice that's how nearly all of them view any efforts to make our economic model more democratic and fair. Amon is painted as jealous of the power and status of benders rather than truly committed to creating a society free of this caste system for the benefit of all. He is constantly depicted not just by how other characters speak of him in the Equalists, but by his own words as someone who just has a personal grudge against benders.
The only thing bending has brought to the world is suffering.
Here, the struggle for equality is portrayed not as a struggle against a legitimate ruling class, but as a hate group who just has an unjustified bigotry against benders. All talk of systemic oppression is neglected. In fact, we see very little actual oppression of non-benders at the hands of benders. We know some bender crime gangs are extorting non-bending shopkeepers, but this doesn't indicate the systemic class system that the Equalists imply. We know the council is made up exclusively of benders, but this is never discussed or confronted in any way, and we certainly don't know that non-benders are being kept out of it, either explicitly or by more societal means. We could assume that, but the show has so little interest in legitimizing the motivations behind this huge revolutionary movement that we kinda just have to take their word for it that they're systemically oppressed. And since we're only going on their word, it becomes incredibly easy to delegitimize their movement by having them constantly be seen to just personally hate benders. And in the end, Amon turns out to actually be a bender himself. This perfectly lines up with the anti-communist myths that reliably crop up about every leader of every socialist country there's ever been. That they are secretly rich, that the wealth they took from the ruling class of their nation just disappeared right into their pockets. That communist leaders are in fact part of the wealthy bourgeois class themselves. That the Equalist leader is a bender himself. And the moment the Equalists see what he really is, they are disillusioned, because their movement wasn't based on a genuine need for systemic change caused by their material conditions. It was just based on hating benders, because the boys wrote them that way. This implies that communist movements are moralistic ones, that they only support working class power because they like them and think they are good. Well, this is Freddie the Beard Engels. He and his pal Carl, they kinda wrote the book on communism. Quite a few books, in fact. Engels was a factory owner, a boss. And their collective works laid the foundation for pretty much every working class movement in the 20th century and beyond. At no point have organized working class socialists turned around and said, wait a minute, Engels did what? Oh, fuck it then, let's call the whole thing off. No, it never happened. It could only have happened if communism was simply based on workers personally hating the rich for no material reason. And that's the version of events that the boys are peddling us with Amon and the Equalists. Amon is, like so many socialist leaders have been, according to the anti-communist narrative, a grifter who is only riding the waves of this liberation movement to secure power for himself and his wealthy allies. The greatest fears that the capitalist and capitalist enthusiast tries to sell us about the communists is that they'll do what capitalists are doing right now. That's the worst case scenario they can imagine, that the communists will simply replicate the status quo. This also echoes the tactics used to cleanly explain away other antagonists from other works who actually have political ideas that might make a little too much sense if the writers aren't careful. Killmonger in Marvel's Black Panther is a great example of this. His hostility towards Wakanda derives from an anger that they stood by, while colonialism enslaved Africans and killed millions of indigenous people, all to enrich the rulers of the settler state. He aims to use Wakanda's exceptional futuristic technology to empower anti-colonial armies, to decolonize the world. Holy shit, that's awesome. So what's the catch? Well, he heavily indicates that he expects to rule this new decolonized world as a king, recreating old power dynamics and potentially not putting power into the hands of the people he claims to want to liberate. And on a personal level, he is shown to consistently be violent towards women, on screen, so that we know he's a bad guy. Thing is, this isn't a valid criticism of these ideas. If you're coming from a position of wanting to communicate that, yeah, socialism has some good ideas, but here's why it goes too far, you need to actually critique socialism. You need to explain why the goals and ideas of socialist tendencies have problems. What they've done instead is invented their own problems that can then be used to invalidate this character and their ideas. Much like violence against women is not a tenet of anti-colonial politics, secretly being a member of the ruling class is not a tenet of any socialist tendencies either. And destroying all the wealth you seize from the ruling class, that's not a socialist tendency. It's just a bad thing that you've speculated might happen because you wrote your characters to do it. That's not a legitimate political criticism. It's the laziest form of propaganda. And the boys ain't done. This is Tarlok. He uses the threat of a revolutionary uprising and the demonization of an outgroup to consolidate power by playing to people's bigotry and fear. Tarlok is, at his core, a fascist.
Republic City stands as a beacon of freedom, but the Equalists are using that freedom to tear it down. The law I have proposed would make it illegal for anyone to be a member of the Equalists, or even be associated with them.
As soon as he's able to assemble a task force, with the support of the police, of course, he sets out to crush the revolution, putting down this marginalized group who is struggling for equality. Tarlok's task force basically declares martial law, turns off the power in non-bending neighborhoods, imposes a curfew on them, and begins mass arrests. We see our first real bender oppression of non-benders through Tarlok near the end of the season. Fascism often rears its head to put down socialist revolutions. Purging the political left is one of the top priorities of the governments put in place by many a fascist coup throughout history. Matter of fact, I made a video about this topic that I'll link in the description for you. And after Tarlok is defeated, well, we learn that he and Amon are brothers. That's right. Fascism and communism are brothers. It was horseshoe theory the whole time, baby! Our two antagonists are conveniently painted as two sides of the same dangerous, radical coin, solidifying the status quo of Republic City as the balanced solution to the societal problems brought up throughout the season, ignoring the fact, of course, that the status quo of Republic City was what created those problems. But listen, there is no alternative. Sorry, pal. This hegemony of neoliberal capitalism as the default and central ideology is further compounded by the revelation that Tarlok and Amon are the way they are not because they had real political convictions or were trying to solve any genuine societal problems, but because they were both deeply traumatized by an abusive, criminal father, pathologizing people who deviate from the status quo. You don't like the way things are? Well, there must be something wrong with you. So, Amon's revolution is not established to be a response to real systemic oppression, a cover for his personal hatred of people in power, only a means for him to gain power, and the result of psychological trauma. Our antagonists are written off as corrupt, dishonest, and deeply damaged. And their ideas? Dismissed. So, what did our protagonist learn from Amon? Did she come to better understand the plight of the oppressed in this society? Did she begin to question the power structure in any meaningful way? Not really. So we're left wondering, what is Korra's solution if Amon's was wrong? The only thing that changes for non-benders is the first non-bender president is elected at the start of the next season. There isn't really any serious systemic change, and everyone just kinda moves on, further reinforcing the idea that the oppression of non-benders wasn't really that substantial to begin with. That's the message the boys are sending. Socialists are making up or exaggerating oppression as a means to gain power.
The Avatar's oppressing us! Help!
Luckily, the non-benders have a president now, and as we all know, the moment a member of a marginalized group becomes president, all systemic oppression they experience disappears. Right? Right?